The cowboy stopped the wedding with one sentence, then asked the town's most feared widow to ride home with him instead. A rifle cracked somewhere beyond the snow-covered hills, just as Ivy Bennett pressed her back against the burning barn wall. Smoke clawed at her throat. Colt Walker grabbed her wrist hard enough to steady her, while a little girl cried upstairs behind a locked door. And through the firelight, someone whispered the dead man's name again. Would you have trusted him after that first kiss? The wind pushed hard through Dry Creek that morning, carrying dust, snow, and the smell of wet horses down Main Street. Folks stood shoulder to shoulder outside the auction platform, with their collars turned up high. Boots scraped frozen mud. Wagon wheels creaked. Somebody laughed too loud near the feed store. Ivy Bennett kept her eyes on the ground. Her gloves were old and split at the fingertips from winter sewing work. The hem of her dark coat brushed against her ankles as she stood near the back of the crowd, holding a folded tax notice in one hand. The paper had softened from how many times she'd read it beside lamplight. Past due. Final notice. Malcolm Pierce stood on the wooden platform in a gray wool coat with a silver watch chain stretched across his vest. Dry Creek's bank belonged to him. So did half the debts in town. And unless payment is settled by Friday, he announced, the Bennett property transfers to Pierce Financial Holdings under territorial collection law. A few people glanced toward Ivy. Most looked away fast. Malcolm noticed her anyway. Well now, he said, smiling without warmth. Mrs. Bennett decided to join us after all. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Ivy said nothing. Malcolm stepped down from the platform slowly, polished boots clicking against frozen boards. Truth is, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, I offered generosity. More than once. Someone near the barber shop muttered, should've left town after that fire. Another voice answered quietly, would you stay where your husband burned alive? The words settled over the street like smoke. Ivy felt it happen again. The same thing that always happened. Conversation stopping, eyes moving, mothers pulling children a little closer. 2 years, and people still looked at her like ash might spread from her skin. Malcolm stopped in front of her. You could still sign the property over peacefully. That house belonged to my husband, Ivy said. Malcolm's smile thinned. Your husband owed money. My husband paid his debts. Then perhaps, Malcolm replied softly. He shouldn't have died before proving it. A few nervous laughs broke out nearby. Ivy's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. You already took his horses, and I'll take the rest too if I must. The church bell rang once across town. Cold air swept between the buildings. Then someone rode in. Heads turned toward the north road, where a tall bay horse pushed through drifting snow. The rider sat straight despite the long trail behind him. Dust coated his dark hat and canvas coat. A rifle rested in the saddle scabbard. Colt Walker. People recognized him immediately. Dry Creek always noticed when a Walker came to town. He swung down from the saddle outside Mercer boarding house and tied the reins without looking at anyone. Big shoulders, quiet eyes, gloves worn pale from rope burn and winter rains. Malcolm's expression shifted slightly. Walker, he called. Back from Montana already? Colt nodded once. Drive ended early. You hear about the new territorial inheritance law yet? I heard. A silence stretched between them. Everybody in town knew about Colt's situation. His brother dead. The ranch tied up in probate. A little girl barely 9 years old, living alone up at Broken Ridge, with only a cowboy uncle trying to raise her. Not proper, according to the county clerk. Not stable. Not enough. Malcolm folded his gloves slowly. Shame about that land requirement. Fine ranch, too. Hate seeing good property fall into government hands. Colt looked toward Ivy then, just one glance. But it stayed there longer than expected. Ivy noticed it immediately, so did everyone else. Malcolm chuckled under his breath. Careful, Walker. Folks say bad luck follows that woman. Colt finally looked back at him. Folks say plenty. Then he walked past the crowd and disappeared inside the boarding house. The auction resumed, but Ivy barely heard it. Her stomach felt hollow. Cold had crept through her boots hours ago. By sundown, snow started falling harder. Dry Creek glowed dim beneath oil lamps and frosted windows. Piano music drifted out from the saloon across the street, while wagon drivers crowded into Ruth Mercer's dining room for stew and coffee. Ivy sat alone near the back corner with a chipped cup warming her hands. Nobody joined her table. Ruth set down fresh coffee without asking. "You eaten today?" "I'm fine." That wasn't the question. Ivy managed half a smile. "Little soup this morning." Ruth sighed and disappeared toward the kitchen. The front door opened again with a burst of wind. Conversation dipped lower. Colt Walker stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. He scanned the room once. Men watched him over whiskey glasses. Then he walked straight toward Ivy. A chair scraped across the wooden floor. He sat down across from her. Up close, he looked tired. Not weak, just worn thin around the edges. Ivy stared at him carefully. "You lost?" "No." "Then people are staring because you picked the wrong table. I picked this one on purpose." The piano downstairs from the saloon carried faintly through the wall. Colt removed his gloves slowly. "I need a wife." Ivy blinked once. He added calmly, "Not company." For the first time all evening, the room went completely silent. Ivy looked at him like he'd lost his mind, and Colt Walker did not look away. The boarding house had gone so quiet she could hear the kitchen stove crackling behind Ruth Mercer's wall. Finally, Ivy set her coffee cup down carefully. "You don't even know me." Colt leaned back slightly in his chair. "I know enough. That makes one of us." A man near the window snorted into his whiskey. Another muttered something about Walker being desperate. Colt ignored both of them. "You got a ranch up at Broken Ridge," Ivy said slowly. "You could marry any woman in this territory." "No," he answered. "I couldn't." The words carried weight. Not pity, not embarrassment, just truth. Ruth appeared beside the table, holding a dish towel in her hands. "Colt," she warned quietly, "you ought to think carefully before starting rumors in my dining room." "I already thought carefully." Ivy studied him. Snow melted slowly from the shoulders of his coat onto the floorboards beneath his chair. He looked like a man who spent more time around cattle than people. His jaw rough from days without shaving. His gloves cracked pale across the knuckles. Not handsome in the polished way town men tried to be, but steady. That was worse somehow. "Why me?" she asked. Colt glanced toward the window where Malcolm Pierce's bank sat dark across the street. "Because you know what it feels like when a town decides who you are before you open your mouth." Ivy's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Nobody spoke for a second. Then she gave a dry laugh. "That's your marriage proposal?" "It's the honest version." Outside, wind rattled the boarding house windows. Colt reached into his coat pocket and placed folded papers on the table between them. County documents, official stamps from Cheyenne. Ivy frowned as she opened them. "Custody transfer?" she murmured. "My brother and his wife died last spring," Colt said. "Fever took her first. He lasted 2 days longer." His voice stayed even. "Their daughter's mine now." Ivy looked up. "Clara." He nodded once. "She's 9, quiet kid, smart." He paused. "Territory says a ranch household needs a proper female guardian if land passes to a minor. And if you don't marry, the state appoints one." Realization moved slowly across Ivy's face. They'll take her. Maybe not today. Maybe not next month. But eventually. Colt looked down briefly at the papers. "And men like Malcolm Pierce are already circling." The room suddenly felt smaller. Ruth lowered herself into the empty chair beside Ivy. "Honey," she said gently, "you don't owe anybody an answer tonight." "I know," but Ivy kept staring at the papers. A little girl alone on a winter ranch. A cowboy trying not to lose the last thing his brother left behind. And Malcolm Pierce waiting like a vulture for both of them to fail. "You understand what people will say?" Ivy asked quietly. "They already say it. They'll think I trapped you." Colt shrugged faintly. Folks in Dry Creek think plenty without help. One corner of Ruth's mouth twitched like she was trying not to smile. The clock near the stairway ticked loudly. At last, Ivy folded the documents closed again. "You asking for a wife," she said carefully. "Or a housekeeper?" Colt met her eyes directly. "I'm asking for a partner in the practical sense. Nothing else unless you want it. No flirting, no charm." That honesty unsettled her more than sweet talk would have. "I don't trust easy things," Ivy admitted. "Good," Colt said. "Neither do I." Snow fell harder overnight. By morning, Dry Creek looked buried beneath white drifts and chimney smoke. Ivy stood outside her small house with one carpetbag at her feet, while Ruth wrapped a scarf tighter around her neck. "You can still say no," Ruth whispered. Ivy glanced toward the wagon waiting near the road. Colt sat in the driver's seat, holding the reins loosely. Beside him was a little girl in a brown coat and knitted mittens too large for her hands, Clara Walker. The child watched Ivy carefully from beneath the hood of her coat without smiling once. Ivy looked back at her tiny house, one window cracked, one porch rail loose, the place where her husband's boots used to sit beside the door. Then she looked toward Malcolm Pierce's bank across town. A man was already measuring the property line with his eyes. "I don't have much left here," Ivy said softly. Ruth squeezed her hand. "Sometimes that's the only reason people find somewhere better." The church wedding happened before noon. No flowers, no music, just a preacher with red hands from the cold and 2 signatures in a record book. A few townspeople stood in back, mostly to gossip. Malcolm Pierce watched from outside beneath the awning of the feed store, silver cane planted in the snow. When the ceremony ended, Colt held the church door open for Ivy, not touching her, not rushing her, just waiting. She stepped out beside him into the hard winter sunlight. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Clara quietly reached up and took Ivy's gloved hand, small fingers, cold from the weather. Ivy looked down in surprise, but the little girl kept her eyes on the snowy street ahead. Broken Ridge Ranch waited somewhere beyond the mountains. And for the first time in 2 years, Ivy Bennett found herself leaving Dry Creek with something she hadn't expected to carry again. Not hope exactly, but maybe the beginning of it. The ride to Broken Ridge Ranch took nearly 5 hours through snow-covered hills and narrow wagon trails half buried by winter wind. Clara sat between them in the wagon seat wrapped in an old buffalo blanket while Colt handled the reins with quiet focus. Nobody talked much. The horses snorted steam into the cold air. Pine trees crowded the higher slopes. Once in a while, Ivy caught sight of elk tracks cutting through the snow near the creek beds. By late afternoon, the mountains turned blue beneath the fading light. Then she saw it. Broken Ridge Ranch sat beneath a long, rocky hill, with smoke rising from the chimney and weather-beaten fences stretching across open white pasture. A red barn leaned slightly against the wind. Lantern light glowed faint behind frosted windows. It looked lonely, but lived in. Colt climbed down first and opened the wagon door for Clara. The little girl stepped carefully onto the packed snow without saying a word. Then Colt reached up toward Ivy. She hesitated only a second before taking his hand. His palm felt rough and warm against the cold. Inside, the house smelled like cedar smoke, coffee grounds, and wool dried too close to a stove. A pair of tiny boots sat near the fireplace beside a rag doll missing one button eye. Clara removed her coat quietly and disappeared upstairs. Colt hung his hat near the door. "Second room down the hall is yours." "Mine?" He glanced at her. "Didn't seem proper putting you in mine the first night." Something about the way he said it made Ivy lower her eyes. "Thank you." He nodded once. "Supper's simple. Bacon and beans mostly. That's more than I had yesterday." For the first time, she saw the corner of his mouth almost move. The evening passed awkwardly at first. Colt ate slowly at the kitchen table while Clara pushed beans around her plate with a spoon. Wind rattled the windows hard enough to shake the lamp flame. Ivy noticed things without meaning to. Colt folded Clara's napkin before she could drop it. He checked the stove twice between bites. He always gave the child the last biscuit. Small habits, quiet ones. The kind people built when nobody was watching. Later, after Clara had gone upstairs, Ivy rolled up her sleeves and started washing dishes in the tin basin near the stove. "You don't have to do that," Colt said. "I know." He stood there a second longer than necessary before stepping outside to bring in firewood. Ivy watched him through the frosted window, carrying logs beneath the moonlight. Snow caught in the shoulders of his coat while the barn lantern swung softly in the wind. A man built from silence, she thought. The next morning came gray and bitter cold. Colt left before sunrise to check fencing near the north pasture. Ivy woke to the sound of boots crossing the porch and the distant creak of saddle leather. When she came downstairs, Clara was already sitting near the stove, reading from an old school primer. The child looked up cautiously. "There's coffee," she said quietly. Ivy blinked in surprise. Clara pointed toward the stove where a blackened pot sat wrapped in cloth to keep warm. "He always leaves some." Ivy poured herself a cup, strong, bitter, still hot. The kitchen windows rattled softly under the wind. "You like horses?" Clara asked suddenly, without looking up from the book. "Yes. We got one everybody says should be put down." That afternoon, Clara led Ivy out to the far stable where an old chestnut mare stood stiff-legged beneath a wool blanket. One front leg dragged slightly when she shifted weight. "Her name's Maybelle," Clara whispered. "Uncle Colt says she's earned the right to stay even if she's no use anymore." Ivy reached gently toward the mare's neck. The horse flinched at first, then settled. "She's got soreness in the shoulder," Ivy murmured. "Not the leg." Clara looked surprised. "Really? She compensates when she walks." For the next hour, Ivy warmed towels near the stable lantern and rubbed the horse carefully while Clara handed her brushes and liniment jars from the shelf. By dusk, the child was talking more freely than before. Not much, but enough. That night, a storm rolled down from the mountains hard and sudden. Snow hammered the roof. Wind screamed through the fence posts outside. Near midnight, someone pounded on Ivy's bedroom door. "Miss Ivy!" Clara's frightened voice. Ivy opened it immediately. The girl stood barefoot in the hallway, clutching a lantern. The south gate broke open. Some cattle got out. A second later, Colt came upstairs already pulling on gloves. Snow covered his shoulders. "Stay inside," he told Clara. Then his eyes moved toward Ivy. "I can ride. You don't even know the trails. You can show me." For a moment, the wind filled the silence between them. Then Colt handed her an extra coat from the wall peg. The storm outside felt alive. Snow slashed sideways beneath the lantern glow as they rode along the ridge searching for scattered cattle. Ivy's fingers burned from the cold, even through leather gloves. "There!" Colt shouted over the wind. 3 cows had wandered dangerously close to a narrow drop near the frozen ravine. Ivy turned her horse sharply to help circle them back. Then the ground beneath her mare shifted. The horse slipped. Everything happened fast after that. A spray of snow, a frightened scream from the animal, and suddenly Ivy was sliding sideways toward the edge of the ravine. Colt lunged from his saddle and caught her coat just before she fell completely. The force slammed her hard against him. Her hands grabbed instinctively at his shoulders. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. Snow blew wild around them, their faces inches apart, breath clouding between them. Then Colt kissed her. Quick, cold, desperate in a way neither of them expected. Ivy froze against him, so did he. And just as suddenly, Colt pulled back like he'd touched fire. The silence afterward felt louder than the storm. "We should get back," he said roughly. Neither of them spoke the entire ride home. But later that night, after Ivy changed clothes and blew out the lamp beside her bed, she opened her door slightly and stopped. Clara was asleep on the hallway floor beneath a blanket, curled up beside Ivy's door instead of hiding behind her own locked one. And downstairs, long after midnight, Ivy could still hear Colt Walker pacing softly across the wooden floorboards. Morning came sharp and pale. The storm had passed, but Broken Ridge Ranch sat buried beneath heavy snowdrifts that reached halfway up the porch steps. Ivy found Colt outside before sunrise, splitting frozen wood beside the barn. Neither of them mentioned the kiss. Not over coffee, not while feeding horses. Not even when their hands brushed reaching for the same saddle strap near the stable wall. That silence followed them for days, but it changed things anyway. Clara noticed first. The little girl started sitting between them at supper instead of at the far end of the table. Once, Ivy caught her watching Colt when he handed Ivy the last biscuit without thinking about it. Children noticed small things adults tried to hide. 3 days later, Ivy rode into Dry Creek with a basket of mending and a list folded inside her coat pocket. Flour, lamp oil, thread. The town looked gray beneath low winter clouds. People stared when she walked into Wilkes General Store, wearing Colt Walker's heavy wool scarf around her neck. Old Mrs. Turner whispered something near the pickle barrels. A man near the stove muttered, "Walker must be blind." Ivy ignored them and paid for her things quietly. Then Malcolm Pierce stepped through the store doorway. Snow melted slowly from the brim of his black hat. "Well," he said smoothly, "Mrs. Walker now, I suppose." The room grew quieter. Ivy folded her receipt carefully. "Afternoon, Mr. Pierce. I heard congratulations are in order." His eyes moved toward the scarf around her neck. Interesting choice by Walker. Men do foolish things in winter. She started toward the door, but Malcolm blocked it with his cane. "You should know," he said softly. "People are already asking questions. People always ask questions. About the fire." Ivy's expression hardened. Malcolm lowered his voice further. "A barn burns down near you once. Maybe it's tragedy. Twice starts sounding like habit." The store clerk looked uncomfortable. Ivy stepped closer instead of backing away. "You seem awfully interested in old fires." Something flickered behind Malcolm's eyes. Only for a second. Then he smiled again. "Careful, Mrs. Walker. Dry Creek buries women quicker than men." When she returned to Broken Ridge near dusk, smoke rolled black against the sky. Ivy dropped the reins instantly. The West Hay barn was burning. Flames roared through dry timber, while ranch hands hauled buckets from the pump in frantic lines across the snow. Horses screamed from nearby corrals. Colt stood near the doorway, coughing through smoke while trying to force open the side stall. "Colt!" He turned at her voice. For one terrible second, Ivy thought he'd run back into the fire. Instead, he staggered out, carrying a saddle blanket over one arm. The roof collapsed behind him with a burst of sparks. Clara stood wrapped in a coat beside the water trough, crying silently. Ivy ran straight to her. "It's all right," she whispered, kneeling in the snow. "You're safe." But Clara shook her head hard. "They're saying you did it." Ivy looked up. 2 ranch hands stood near the fence, whispering. One of them wouldn't meet her eyes. And somewhere behind them, someone muttered low enough to almost miss. "Where that woman goes, fire follows." The words hit colder than the wind. Later that night, the burned barn still smoked beneath the moonlight. Colt sat at the kitchen table with soot dark across his jaw, while Sheriff Amos Reed thumbed through a notebook beside the stove. "Could started from the lantern hooks," Amos said. "Hard wind tonight." Colt stared at the black coffee in front of him. "Maybe," but Colt looked toward the window. South latch was cut. Silence settled heavily. Amos glanced briefly toward Ivy. "You got enemies, Walker. Not enough to burn winter feed." Ivy stood slowly. "I want to see the barn." "You don't need to," Colt said immediately. "I do." The snow outside crunched beneath her boots as she crossed toward the ruins carrying a lantern. Smoke still drifted through the beams. Half the roof had fallen inward. Something silver caught the lantern light near the collapsed stall wall. Ivy crouched slowly, then froze. A lighter. Small. Engraved silver. Her breath stopped. She knew that lighter. Her husband had carried one exactly like it the night he died. Miss Ivy? She turned sharply. Wade Pierce stood near the barn entrance, with snow dusting his coat collar. Malcolm's son looked cleaner than most ranchmen. Soft hands, expensive boots, and eyes that watched too carefully. Terrible thing, Wade said quietly. Fire's a cruel way to lose something. Ivy closed her hand around the lighter. What are you doing here? Father sent supplies. His gaze dropped briefly toward her fist. Funny thing about old tragedies. Sometimes they have a way of coming back around. A chill moved through her that had nothing to do with winter. The next afternoon, Sheriff Amos pulled Colt aside near the stable while Ivy brushed snow from Mabel's blanket nearby. Your wife's husband, Amos said quietly. Before he died, he'd been asking questions. Colt looked up. Questions about what? Water deeds, land transfers. Amos lowered his voice further. Some folks around Dry Creek think Malcolm Pierce has been stealing creek access from smaller ranches for years. And Ivy's husband knew. Maybe enough to get himself killed. Colt's jaw tightened. That night the wind rose again, and sometime after midnight Ivy woke to Clara screaming. The child's bed was empty. The back door stood open wide against the snow. Colt was already pulling on boots when Ivy ran downstairs. Fresh wagon tracks cut deep through the yard, heading north toward the abandoned rail line beyond the ridge. Then Ivy saw something half buried near the porch post. A child's mitten, Clara's, and beside it cigar ash. The same sweet tobacco Wade Pierce smoked in town. Colt saw it too. His face changed instantly, not panic, something colder. He grabbed the lantern from the porch hook and headed toward the stable without another word. I'm coming with you, Ivy said. No, she knows me. If Clara's scared, she'll come to my voice faster. Colt tightened the saddle strap hard enough to creak leather. Snow blew sideways through the yard while the horses stamped nervously inside the barn. Finally, he nodded once. Stay close to me. The wagon tracks cut north beyond Broken Ridge, through frozen pine and old railroad ground nobody used anymore. The trail grew rougher near the abandoned freight depot, where rusted rails disappeared into drifts of snow. A light flickered faint in the distance. Colt raised one hand. They stopped near a stand of dead cottonwoods. The old storage barn leaned crooked beside the tracks, with one broken window glowing lantern yellow from inside. Ivy could hear wind rattling loose tin overhead, then a child crying. Clara. Ivy moved before Colt could stop her. She pushed through the barn door into stale hay dust and cold smoke. Clara sat tied loosely beside a feed barrel with tears streaking her cheeks. Miss Ivy! Ivy rushed toward her, and Wade Pierce stepped out from behind the shadows with a revolver hanging low beside his leg. Easy now, he said softly. Colt entered behind Ivy, shotgun already raised. For one long second, nobody moved. Wade looked calmer than he should have. Snow melted slowly off his coat collar while lantern light shook across his face. You kidnapped a child, Colt said quietly. Wade shrugged once. Wasn't supposed to go this far. Then why'd you do it? His eyes shifted toward Ivy, because she keeps digging where she shouldn't. Ivy felt Clara clutch her sleeve. The lighter, Ivy whispered. It was yours. Something flickered across Wade's face. Not guilt, memory. That barn fire 2 years ago, Ivy said slowly. You were there. Wade laughed under his breath. Your husband should have minded his business. Colt's grip tightened on the shotgun. What business? Wade glanced toward the window like he could already see the whole town collapsing beneath him. Your dead husband found papers, water deeds, transfers. His smile turned thin. Turns out Malcolm Pierce didn't build his bank honest. Ivy's heartbeat thudded hard in her ears. My husband knew? He knew enough. Wade rubbed one hand across his jaw. He threatened to go to Sheriff Reed, said he had copies hidden. Clara looked up fearfully between them. Ivy kept her voice steady somehow. So you killed him. Wade's expression changed fast then. Anger replacing control. I didn't mean to. The words echoed through the barn. Silence followed. Snow hissed outside against warped wood walls. Wade swallowed hard. He grabbed me first. We fought. His breathing turned uneven. Lantern got knocked over. Fire spread too damn quick. Ivy stared at him. 2 years. 2 years carrying the weight of whispers and stares and closed doors while the real truth sat drinking whiskey beside his father in town. You let them blame me, she said quietly. Wade looked away first. My father handled the rest. Something inside Colt finally snapped loose. He stepped forward with murder sitting plain in his eyes. Wade saw it immediately and raised the revolver. Clara screamed, but Ivy moved first. She caught Colt's arm hard enough to stop him 1 step before the gunfire. If you become them, she whispered shakily, we lose everything. Colt stood, frozen beside her, breathing hard. The shotgun slowly lowered. Outside came the sudden thunder of horses. Sheriff Amos Reed burst through the barn doors with 2 deputies behind him. Wade turned sharply toward the sound. Big mistake. Colt crossed the distance in one violent movement and slammed him against the feed wall before the revolver could rise. The gun hit the dirt floor beside the hay bales. Deputies grabbed Wade immediately. The barn filled with shouting, lantern smoke, frightened horses. But Ivy barely heard any of it. She stood there holding Clara while Amos Reed knelt beside the dropped revolver. You all right? The sheriff asked gently. Clara nodded against Ivy's shoulder. Amos rose slowly and looked at Wade with disgust. Your father's done. Wade's face went pale. You can't prove anything. Oh, I think we can. Amos pulled folded papers from inside his coat. Found forged water deeds in Malcolm's office tonight, along with letters tying him to half the Stolen Creek claims in this county. Wade stopped struggling. Outside, dawn was beginning to gray the horizon. Colt stepped toward Ivy carefully, like he wasn't sure she'd let him close after all this. You hurt? He asked quietly. She shook her head, but her eyes looked different now. Not haunted, just tired, very tired. Clara reached for Colt's hand with one mittened hand, while holding Ivy's coat sleeve with the other. And standing there in that freezing barn beside old railroad tracks and the ruins of somebody else's lies, the 3 of them looked less like strangers than they had the day before. Much less. Maybe that's what home really is. Not the house you started in. Not the town that judged you. Not even the name people used when they whispered about you behind closed doors. Maybe home is the place where somebody finally sees you clearly and stays. If you've ever carried a past that wouldn't let go of you, if you've ever walked into a room and felt people decide who you were before you even spoke, then you probably understand Ivy better than most. And maybe you understand Colt too, because sometimes the strongest kind of love isn't loud. It's a cup of coffee left warm on the stove before sunrise, a hand reaching for yours in the dark, a man choosing not to become cruel, even when anger would have been easier. Out in places like Dry Creek, winter could harden a person. But every once in a while, life handed somebody a second chance anyway, not to erase the scars, just to stop living inside them. And somewhere beyond those snowy ridges, with the barn smoke fading into the morning sky, Ivy finally stopped looking like a woman the town feared. She looked like someone who belonged. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me in the comments where you would have gone after leaving Dry Creek. And if you'd like, stay a little longer. There are still more dusty roads, quiet cowboys, broken hearts, and healing stories waiting just beyond the next lantern light.